They sold her like she was furniture, not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she deserved it, but because the woman who called herself a mother needed $50,000 and a way out of a debt that was going to get everyone in that house killed. Celine Mercer stood barefoot in a filthy Seattle alley at 2 in the morning, rain coming down hard enough to sting, and watched the only family she'd ever known drive away without looking back. No hesitation, no tears, just taillights swallowed by the dark. She was 24 years old and she had just been handed to the most feared man in the Pacific Northwest. His name was Valentino Vescari, and every single person who knew that name believed she was already dead. They were wrong, but not in the way anyone expected. If you want to know how a girl sold for $50,000 ends up running a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions, stay until the end, hit like, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The alley smelled like rotting fish and diesel and something chemical underneath both of those things that Celine couldn't name and didn't want to. She stood with her back against a dumpster, the metal cold through her thin cotton shirt, rain plastering her dark hair flat against her neck and shoulders. Her feet were bare because she hadn't had time to grab shoes. That was the part that kept hitting her in strange waves. Not the betrayal, not the fear, not even the black SUVs idling at the alley entrance like patient predators. Just the fact that she was standing on wet asphalt in her bare feet and nobody had thought to let her put on shoes first. She'd been asleep when they came for her. Her stepmother Diane had knocked on her bedroom door just after midnight. Celine remembered the knock being oddly gentle, which should have been the warning. Diane was never gentle. In 11 years of living under the same roof, Celine could count on one hand the number of times Diane had spoken to her without an edge in her voice. So when the knock came soft and almost apologetic, some part of Celine's sleeping brain registered it as wrong before she was even fully conscious. She'd opened the door in her sleep shirt and bare feet. Diane was standing in the hallway in her coat, fully dressed, her daughter Priya behind her with a duffel bag over one shoulder and her eyes aimed somewhere near the floor. Two men Celine had never seen before stood at the end of the hallway, near the top of the stairs. Big men. The kind whose suits cost more than Celine made in 3 months at the accounting firm downtown. "You need to come with them," Diane said. Not a question, not an explanation, just that. Celine remembered the exact sensation, a cold drop somewhere in her chest, like ice water spilling through her ribcage. "What?" "There's a debt." Diane's voice was flat and practiced, like she'd been rehearsing this. "Marcus ran up a debt before he died, and I can't cover it. This is how it gets settled. Marcus, her father, dead 14 months ago from a heart attack that Celine still wasn't entirely sure was natural. She'd asked questions about it. She'd stopped asking after Diane made it clear the questions were unwelcome. "You're selling me," Celine said. The word hung in the hallway air. Priya flinched. Diane didn't. "I'm settling a debt," Diane said. "It's not the same thing." It was exactly the same thing, and every person in that hallway knew it. Celine looked at the two men. They weren't looking back at her the way men look at women they want. They were looking at her the way men look at a package they've been sent to collect, with boredom and mild impatience. That was almost worse somehow. She thought about running. She thought about it for approximately 3 seconds before she understood that there was nowhere to run to. She had $47 in her checking account. She had no close friends because Diane and Priya had spent 11 years slowly dismantling every relationship she'd tried to build. She had her job at the accounting firm, which paid enough to cover her share of the household expenses that Diane insisted she contribute to, despite the fact that Celine was essentially free household labor as well as a paying tenant in her own childhood home. She had nothing. She had been systematically left with nothing, and she hadn't fully understood the geometry of that until this moment. She went with the men. They walked her out through the front door. Not roughly, not with any visible force, just with a firm surrounding presence that made it clear the decision had already been made, and put her in the back of one of the SUVs. She sat between two men who smelled like expensive cologne and gun oil. The car pulled away from the curb. Through the tinted window, she watched the house where she'd grown up recede and disappear. Diane never came to the front door to watch them leave. That detail lodged itself somewhere deep and painful, The drive was 40 minutes through downtown Seattle and then north along the coast, rain hammering the roof of the SUV the entire time. Nobody spoke to her. The men on either side of her stared straight ahead. The driver was invisible behind a privacy partition. Celine sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and focused on her breathing. In through the nose, slow, controlled. The way she'd taught herself to breathe during the bad years when panic attacks used to hit her in grocery stores and parking lots, and once, memorably, in the middle of a quarterly budget presentation at work. Control the breath. Control everything else follows from that. It was a lie she'd been telling herself for years, but it was a useful lie. They drove through a gate that opened from a distance, up a long approach road through dense Pacific firs, and arrived at a structure that Celine's brain initially filed under the wrong category. It looked like an estate, like somewhere a tech billionaire might live, all glass and steel and deliberate architecture set into the coastal bluff above the water. The Pacific stretched away to the west, black and enormous in the rain. The mansion's lights were mostly dark, but the ones that burned with a quality of illumination that felt permanent and merciless. She was walked inside. A woman met them in the entrance hall. Middle-aged, efficient-looking, no warmth in her face, but no cruelty either, just the flat competence of someone who'd been managing logistics for a long time and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She introduced herself as Mrs. Harrow and told Celine to follow her. They went upstairs. Not to a basement. Not to somewhere dark and industrial. Upstairs to a room on the second floor that had a window overlooking the water and a bed with clean sheets and a bathroom attached. The room was sparse but not unkind. There were towels folded on the dresser. "You'll find clothes in the closet," Mrs. Harrow said. "They should be your size. Breakfast is at 7. There are no locks on the exterior gates that you can operate, and the grounds have security coverage. I'd advise against testing the boundaries before you've spoken with Mr. Vescari." Celine stood in the middle of the room in her wet sleep shirt and bare feet and said, "When do I meet him?" "Tomorrow," Mrs. Harrow said. "He's occupied tonight." She left. The door didn't lock from the outside. That was the second thing that surprised Celine, after the room itself. She stood at the window for a long time, watching rain streak the glass, watching the black water move far below. Her brain was running through the same loop it always ran through under stress, itemizing, cataloging, assessing. What did she know? What did she not know? What were the variables? What were the constants? She knew the name Valentino Vescari. Everyone in Seattle knew that name at a remove, the way everyone knows the name of the weather pattern that flooded the valley 2 years ago. Not personally, but as a force, as a category of event. He ran the largest organized crime operation on the West Coast. Legitimate businesses on the surface, the full architecture of violence and corruption underneath. Dock workers, shipping routes, financial networks, political connections. People who crossed him vanished in ways that discouraged other people from asking where they'd gone. She didn't know why he'd accepted her as payment for a gambling debt. That was the part that didn't compute. She didn't know what he wanted from her. She fell asleep eventually, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, because she couldn't make herself lie down on the clean sheets in this stranger's house. Sleep came for her the way it always did under extreme stress, sudden and total, like a wall. She met him the next morning. Mrs. Harrow came for her at 8, which meant Celine had missed breakfast, which she only noticed because her stomach made a sound when she stood up. She'd managed to shower and find clothes in the closet, dark jeans, a plain gray top, both fitting well enough that the sizing had clearly been deliberate, and had spent 30 minutes sitting on the edge of the bed, telling herself to think like an accountant. Numbers, structures. What are the assets and what are the liabilities and what's the actual bottom line of this situation? She had one asset, her mind, specifically her ability with financial systems, which was considerable and which her employer downtown only valued to the degree that she made quarterly reports look clean. Liabilities were extensive. She didn't think about the liabilities. Valentino Vescari was standing in a room that faced the water, his back to her when she entered. The room was a study or an office, with bookshelves on 2 walls, and a desk that looked like it was made from a single piece of wood that cost more than Celine's car. He didn't turn around immediately. He let her stand in the doorway for a moment that stretched just long enough to be intentional. When he turned, her first thought was that he didn't look like what the name sounded like. The name Valentino Vescari sounded theatrical, Italianate, the kind of name that belongs to someone with a certain studied menace about them. The man in front of her was tall and lean in a way that suggested the leanness was maintained rather than natural, and his face was not handsome exactly, but arresting, sharp-featured, dark eyes that moved across her with an assessment she felt physically, like pressure. He was somewhere in his late 30s. There was a scar along his jaw that hadn't been put there carefully. He looked tired. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not defeated, not soft, but tired in the particular way of someone who has been awake with a problem for too long and is running the numbers on it in real time. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing. Not a power move exactly. More like he was too restless to sit, like sitting would cost him something he couldn't spare. He looked at her for a moment. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes." "You know what this arrangement is? My stepmother's interpretation of it, or yours?" Something shifted fractionally in his expression. Not surprise, more like recalibration. "Tell me the difference." "She thinks she sold me to you as property," Celine said. "I don't know what you think you bought." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the rain had let up, and the Pacific was the color of hammered pewter. "She sold me a debt settlement," he said finally. "The specifics of what that means aren't decided yet." What were they supposed to be? Hospitality. The word was delivered without inflection. Celine held the eye contact. Her pulse was doing something uncomfortable in her throat. "And now?" "Now I'm looking at you and trying to figure out if there's a more useful application." He said it like he was talking about a piece of equipment. She didn't think it was cruelty. She thought it was just how he framed things, transactionally, categorically, without the social lubricant that other people applied to make uncomfortable truths easier to hear. "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "I have 6 years of experience with complex financial structures, shell corporations, offshore vehicles, and tax optimization. I can read a balance sheet the way most people read a text message. Whatever debt my stepmother owed you, I'm worth more than $50,000 in practical utility." The silence that followed was longer this time. He looked at her the way she'd seen senior partners look at a junior analyst who'd just said something unexpectedly precise in a meeting. "Who told you the number?" he said. "Nobody. I'm guessing based on the size of the debt Diane could have accumulated gambling. She's been in deep for at least 3 years. The behavioral pattern is consistent." Another pause. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know." She kept her voice level. "Most people aren't, once you look past the obvious." He didn't respond to that. He looked at her for another moment, then moved to his desk and sat down. The first time she'd seen him sit, and it seemed to cost him slightly. A brief tightening around the jaw that he controlled immediately. Something hurt. She filed that away without reacting to it. "Mrs. Harrow will show you the rest of the house," he said. "You'll have the run of the interior. The grounds require accompaniment until I say otherwise. There are rules. She'll explain them." "That's it?" Celine said. "What did you expect?" She didn't answer that because the honest answer was something she hadn't let herself form into clear language yet. She stood, and she walked out, and she didn't look back, because looking back was something she was trying to stop doing. The days that followed had a quality she didn't have a word for immediately. Not comfort. Comfort was something she'd almost forgotten the texture of. Not safety. Safety had never really been a feature of her experience, something between suspension and waiting, like the moment before an equation resolves. The house was enormous and quiet. She explored it in the way she explored everything, systematically and without appearing to. There were approximately 40 rooms on 3 floors, a network of underground corridors she found on the 3rd day, when she noticed a seam in the wall of the ground floor library that turned out to be a door. She didn't go into the corridors immediately. She noted them and moved on. There were staff, Mrs. Harrow, a cook named Elena, who was 60 years old and communicative only about food, 2 groundskeepers who were clearly also security, and a rotation of men she never saw the same face twice from who moved through the house with the quiet purposefulness of people whose job involved contingencies. There were also, she gradually understood, other operations happening in a wing of the house she wasn't shown. The eastern wing. The doors were reinforced. The sounds from behind them were intermittent and told her nothing specific. Valentino was present in the house, but rarely visible. She ate breakfast alone most mornings. Occasionally, she saw him crossing the entrance hall or moving through the library with someone she'd never seen before, speaking in low voices. He never acknowledged her in passing, which was its own kind of communication. She found the library useful. It had financial texts, legal volumes, several shelves of geopolitical analysis, and a shelf of Italian novels that seemed out of place until she thought about it more, and it stopped seeming out of place. She read in the evenings, sitting in the chair by the window that faced the water, and tried not to think about her life downtown, her small apartment that she'd been paying rent on remotely and would probably be evicted from within the month. Her job at the accounting firm where she'd just been passed over for a promotion she'd been told was coming for 2 years. None of that existed in a useful way anymore. She was trying to understand the new equation, what the variables were, what she could affect. She'd been in the house 9 days when she found the first anomaly. It was an accident in the strict sense. She hadn't been looking for anything, had just been sitting in the library when a stack of binders on the lower shelf caught her eye because they were arranged with a deliberate disorder that suggested someone had replaced them hastily. She pulled one out. It was financial documentation, not organized financial documentation, but the kind of partial records that happen when someone is assembling information from multiple sources and hasn't finished cleaning it up. She almost put it back. Almost. She sat on the floor of the library instead and went through it for 2 hours. The numbers told a story, not a complete story. Too many gaps, too many redacted figures, too much that was clearly coded in a system she didn't have the key to yet. But the shape of a story, the skeleton of it. And what the skeleton suggested made something cold settle in her stomach. Someone inside this organization was systematically bleeding it, not in obvious ways, not in ways that would show up on a surface review, but there, in the structure of certain transfers, in the pattern of fees across subsidiary accounts, in a rhythm of minor losses that individually meant nothing but collectively represented a significant and sustained extraction. She put the binder back exactly as she'd found it. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she went to dinner. The night everything changed was 12 days after she arrived. She'd been awake since 2 in the morning, the way she sometimes got. Mind running, wouldn't stop, too many variables and not enough data. She'd come downstairs for water and was standing in the kitchen in the dark when she heard him. Not heard him speak. Heard him move. Heavy, uneven footsteps in the hallway outside the kitchen, the kind of movement that had effort in it. She went to the doorway. Valentino was in the hallway. He was upright but barely, one hand against the wall, the other pressed against his side. His shirt was dark with blood. His face was pale was too mild a word. Gray. The kind of color that precedes unconsciousness. She didn't scream, she didn't freeze. She crossed the hallway in 4 steps, got her shoulder under his arm, and said, "Where are they?" He looked at her. His eyes were focused, but only barely. "Where are who?" "Your people, the ones who are supposed to be watching the house." "Compromised situation," he said, and his voice was still controlled, which impressed her despite everything. "External threat has been neutralized. This is—" He stopped, seemed to be managing something internal. "Manageable." "It's not manageable if you bleed out in my hallway," she said. "Sit down." He didn't sit. He stood there with his hand against the wall and his jaw set, and she understood that sitting was not something he was going to do voluntarily, because sitting meant weakness, and weakness in his world had a specific cost. So she didn't argue it. She said, "Kitchen, light's better." He followed her into the kitchen. She turned on the light above the stove rather than the overhead, bright enough to work, not the full exposure of fluorescence. She found the first aid kit under the sink because she'd located it on day 2. She pulled a chair from the table and positioned it without asking him to use it, just positioned it, and he sat down. The wound was a knife cut along his left side, deep enough to need stitching, but not deep enough to have hit anything critical. She could see that much when she got his shirt off. He had other scars. Several of them, distributed across his torso in a way that told a long story she wasn't going to think about right now. The current wound had been partially dressed, badly, with what looked like someone's improvised effort in the field. "This was done by someone who knows what they're doing," she said, examining the edges of the cut. "Yes. One of yours." He looked at her with an expression that gave nothing away. She threaded the suture needle. "I took a wilderness first aid course 3 years ago," she said, obsessively. "I was going through a phase where I thought being self-sufficient in emergencies was important." "Was it?" "Apparently, yes." She met his eyes. "This is going to hurt." "I'm aware." She worked. Her hands were steady, steadier than she would have predicted, but she'd always been that way. Always found that the stress response in her ran inward rather than outward, manifesting as focus rather than trembling. He didn't make a sound through any of it. She could feel the tension in the muscles under her hands, the rigid control of someone managing significant pain through nothing but will. And it was not the same thing as bravery exactly, but it was something adjacent to it. She finished, taped it, sat back. He looked down at the work and then at her. "You've done this before." "A deer," she said, "on a camping trip. Different stitching requirements, but the principle is similar." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something. He said, "Why did you help me?" She considered the question seriously because he was asking it seriously. "Because you're bleeding and I know how to stop it," she said, "and because dead men don't resolve arrangements. You think I'm going to die. I think you were going to. Less so now." He was quiet for a moment, sitting in the chair in the kitchen of his own house with his shirt off and her field sutures in his side. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a person rather than a category. "Who did this to you?" she said. He didn't answer. "The numbers in the library," she said. "The binders with the partial financial records. Someone inside your organization is extracting significant funds through a system of minor patterned losses across subsidiary accounts. I can identify who if you give me full access to the financial records. Not partial records. Full access." He looked at her for a long time. "You went through those binders." "Yes." "You weren't authorized." "No. Most people who do unauthorized things in this house don't repeat the behavior." "I'm not most people in this house," she said, "and you know that. You figured that out in the first conversation. I could see it." Another silence. Longer. His eyes moved across her face in a way that felt like calculation, but also like something else, something less clean than calculation, and she held herself still under the scrutiny. "Rafael De Luca," he said finally, "my second in command. He's been managing the financial division since my accountant—" He stopped. "Since a position became vacant." "Recently vacant," she said. "Under what circumstances?" "Unclear." "The pattern in those records goes back at least 20 months, she said. "Whatever happened to your accountant, I'd want to know the timeline relative to when this extraction began." He looked at her without speaking. "Full access," she said, "to the financial records, all of them. Give me 30 days. "And what do you want in exchange?" "A negotiated arrangement," she said. "Something with actual terms instead of whatever this is currently." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Go to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." She stood up. She looked at the sutures. "Don't pull those," she said. She went back upstairs. She lay awake until dawn anyway, but for different reasons than before. The access came within a week. Not all at once, not without friction. There were 3 conversations that Celine would describe as negotiations in the technical sense, meaning both parties gave ground, both parties held positions, neither party found the process comfortable. But the access came. A laptop with encrypted access to the organization's financial architecture, delivered to the library by Mrs. Harrow, with the same brisk efficiency with which Mrs. Harrow delivered everything. Celine sat down with it and started at the beginning. What she found over the following 3 weeks was extraordinary, in the specific way that forensic accounting discoveries are extraordinary. Not exciting, not dramatic, but precise. The kind of precision that builds from detail and accumulates into something devastating. Rafael De Luca was not just stealing from the organization. He was running a parallel financial architecture, a shadow economy inside the legitimate criminal economy, siphoning funds through a network of shell structures so complex and so carefully maintained that it had survived undetected for, by her estimate, 23 months. The amounts were large, not catastrophically large in isolation. No single transaction she found exceeded $100,000, because the point was never the individual transactions. The point was the aggregate. By her conservative calculation, Over 23 months, Rafael De Luca had extracted somewhere between $12 and $14 million from Valentino Vescari's organization. And that was conservative. She built the evidence file methodically, cross-referencing transaction patterns, establishing the timeline, documenting the structural linkages between the shell entities and Rafael's known financial interests. She didn't tell Valentino what she was finding as she found it. She waited until she had something complete. When she brought it to him, it was a Tuesday morning, 8 in the morning, the Pacific visible in silver through the office window. She put the printed documentation on his desk and stood back. He read through it, all of it. He read the way she'd observed him doing other things, completely, with total focus, no interruptions. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the water for a long time. 23 months, he said, at minimum. The methodology may go back further, but the records I had access to only cover 23 months. He said it again, and this time there was something underneath the flatness, something with weight in it. There's a captain's meeting scheduled, Celine said. Next week, according to the calendar Mrs. Harrow showed me. Yes. I could present this there, she said. The full evidence. All of it. Public disclosure to the full leadership. He looked at her. Why? Because a private confrontation gives him warning and opportunity. A public one takes both away at once. She paused. And because it establishes something about the new financial oversight structure that will prevent this from being easy to repeat. He was watching her with that expression she'd been cataloging over the past weeks, the one that wasn't quite readable, that sat somewhere between assessment and something she didn't have a name for yet. You've thought about what comes after, he said. I always think about what comes after. Most people who work for me don't. I don't work for you, she said. We're in a negotiated arrangement with terms that haven't been fully defined yet. The corner of his mouth moved again. The same almost thing it had done in the kitchen the night she stitched him up. The meeting is Thursday, he said. You'll present. She nodded. Rafael will be there. I know. He's not a man who takes public humiliation quietly. I know that too, she said. I've read his financial history for 3 weeks. I know the shape of how he responds to threat. She picked up the documentation from his desk. Make sure I have a clear path to the exit. She left the office. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with the documentation against her chest and the weight of Thursday in her stomach like a stone. She'd done careful things her whole life. She'd worked hard and kept her head down and tried to be useful and good enough, and it had landed her sold to a criminal in a midnight alley. So she was done being careful in the old way. The captain's meeting was in 3 days. She was going to walk into a room full of men who had spent their lives using violence as a primary tool, and she was going to stand up and dismantle one of their own with nothing but numbers and precision and the thing she'd always had, the thing nobody had ever thought to be afraid of. Her mind. 3 days. She went back to the library and kept working. The night before Thursday, she didn't sleep at all. She sat at the window with the documentation in her lap, going through it again. Not because there was anything to add, but because movement helped. Even the movement of eyes across a page. The Pacific was dark and enormous outside. Somewhere below the bluff, waves were doing what waves do, indifferent and continuous. She thought about her father, not about his death, but about something he'd said to her when she was 9 years old and had come home crying because a teacher had told her that being good at math wasn't a real skill and wouldn't take her anywhere. Her father had sat her down at the kitchen table and spread out his quarterly tax documents and said, "Numbers don't lie, Celine. People lie. Numbers just say what is. You learn to read what is, you'll never be helpless." He'd been wrong about a lot of things. He'd married Diane, which was the central miscalculation of his life. But he hadn't been wrong about that. She thought about the room she was going to walk into tomorrow, the men in it, the way they'd look at her. A 24-year-old woman with no title and no standing in their world, standing up to accuse the second-in-command of the most powerful organization on the West Coast. She thought about Rafael De Luca's face when he understood what was happening. She thought about Valentino watching from across the room. She turned the last page of the documentation over in her lap and looked at the water. Numbers don't lie. Thursday morning came gray and cold, marine fog thick against the windows, the kind of visibility that collapsed distance. Celine dressed carefully, not to impress, but to occupy space. Dark suit she'd found in the closet that fit her like it had been chosen by someone who understood how clothing becomes armor. Hair pulled back. Nothing performative. Nothing that said she was trying. She went downstairs. The captains were already arriving. She heard their voices in the east reception room, low and overlapping. She heard Rafael De Luca's voice among them, easy, confident, the social warmth of a man who'd learned how to make dangerous people comfortable around him. Mrs. Harrow appeared at her elbow. "Mr. Vescari is ready." Celine took one breath, felt it fill her chest, felt it go. In through the nose, slow, controlled. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. The room went quiet when she entered. Not completely. The kind of quiet where conversations don't stop but become aware of themselves, become self-conscious. 12 men, some seated, some standing, all of them looking at her with the specific expression of people who don't know what category to put her in. Valentino was standing near the window. He caught her eye briefly. His expression gave her nothing. She hadn't expected it to. She moved to the front of the room. She set the documentation on the table, and she began. She spoke for 22 minutes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform outrage or drama. She walked through the evidence the way she walked through any complex financial analysis, linearly, precisely, building from the base data to the structural patterns to the aggregate conclusions. She let the numbers speak in the tone they always spoke in, which was flat and absolute and immune to charisma. She watched Rafael De Luca's face change across those 22 minutes, the easy confidence fading, the social warmth cooling to something harder, something calculating. When she finished, the room was completely silent. She said, "I can make the full documentation available to each of you for independent review." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Rafael said smoothly, almost admiringly, "Where did you find her?" The question was aimed at Valentino, and it was not really a question. It was a message, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been sending messages in plain sight for 23 months. Celine recognized the coding in it. She said before Valentino could respond, "The more relevant question is where you found the audacity to steal $14 million from the people in this room." The silence after that had a different quality, heavier. The kind of silence that precedes consequential things. Rafael looked at her. His smile was still present, but it had come unstuck from the rest of his face. "You're brave," he said quietly. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." Valentino's voice from across the room was level and final. "This meeting is adjourned. Rafael, remain." The captains filed out. Some of them looked at Celine as they passed. Some of them looked at her the way she'd wanted them to look at her. Not with desire or pity or the vague condescension of men who've never had to take a woman seriously, but with something she recognized as the beginning of respect. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. She walked out one of the rest of them and stood in the corridor outside and felt the shaking start in her hands. The delayed physical response she always got after high-stakes performances. The body's protest at having been kept under control for too long. She pressed her hands flat against the wall. Cold marble. She focused on the cold. From behind the closed door she heard nothing. The walls were thick. She stood there for a long time. She didn't know what Rafael was saying to Valentino in that room. She didn't know what Valentino would decide. She didn't know what came next. What she knew was that 48 hours ago, she'd been an invisible woman in a borrowed room trying to understand the mathematics of her own survival. And now 12 of the most dangerous men on the West Coast knew her name, knew what she could do. That was a different equation. Mrs. Harrow appeared at the end of the corridor. "Mr. Vescari would like to see you," she said. "In the study. Tonight at 9. Celine nodded. She peeled her hands off the wall. Her fingers were still shaking, but only slightly. She thought about what Rafael had looked like when his smile came unstuck. She thought about what Valentino was deciding behind that closed door. She walked back to the library. She sat down. She waited. 9 o'clock came. She knocked on the study door and went in. Valentino was sitting at his desk and he looked, not shaken exactly because she wasn't sure he was capable of that, but different. Something resolved in his face that hadn't been resolved before, like a calculation he'd been running had finally terminated. "Rafael De Luca has been removed from his position," he said. "Permanently?" she said. He looked at her with something that might have been dark amusement. Don't ask questions you don't need the answers to. She understood. She nodded. The financial division needs a new director, he said. Not immediately. There are interim arrangements, but within 90 days I need someone in that position who I can trust with full access and who has the technical competence to manage what we've discussed. She held herself very still. I want to offer you the position, he said. The title. With real authority, not decorative. The compensation structure. We'll negotiate that separately. The point is that I'm offering it. She looked at him for a moment. 3 months ago, I was an accountant in a downtown office who couldn't afford good shoes, she said. 6 weeks ago, you were in an alley in your bare feet, he said. Circumstances change. She thought about her father's table. The quarterly tax documents. Numbers just say what is. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. The arrangement becomes formal, contracted, with protections. Specify what you mean by protections. I mean that I'm not property. I'm not collateral. If this arrangement ends, I leave with what I've earned, and I leave without consequences. He looked at her steadily. Agreed. And Diane's debt is retired, she said. Not forgiven? I don't care about forgiveness. Just retired. It's done. She has no further claim on me through it. Done. Then yes, she said. He nodded once. He looked at his desk. Then he looked back at her, and for the briefest second there was something in his face that wasn't transactional, something that moved differently than the rest of him. She registered it and let it go. 9 o'clock tomorrow, he said. We'll go through the interim financial structure. She turned to leave. She was at the door when he said, Celine. She stopped. What you did today, he said. In that room. Raphael has killed men for less provocation. I know, she said. You knew that going in. Yes. A pause. Why? She thought about it, gave him the true answer rather than the useful one. Because doing it scared me less than not doing it, she said, and I'm trying to stop being afraid of things that won't keep me alive. She went out. Standing in the hallway, she heard something from behind the closed office door. Not a voice, just a sound. Small. Almost nothing. She could have sworn it was him exhaling, like he'd been holding something for a long time, like he'd finally let it out. She walked upstairs. The house was quiet around her. Through the windows, the Pacific was black and continuous, and somewhere out there in the dark, across those deep, indifferent miles of water, the fog had lifted enough to show the first stars. She stood at her window and looked at them. She had a position. She had terms. She had something she'd never had in 11 years of being Diane's convenient possession. She had leverage. She had ground to stand on. She didn't know yet that within 6 weeks, the man who'd just agreed to every one of her conditions would put 2 fingers under her chin in the dark of a storm-cut corridor and look at her like she was something he hadn't been ready for, and that she would look back at him the exact same way. She didn't know that Raphael DeLuca wasn't finished. She didn't know that the captains who'd watched her dismantle him in that room were already divided, some of them reassessing, some of them afraid, and one of them already on the phone with someone in a rival organization describing what he'd witnessed and what it might mean for the balance of power on the West Coast. She didn't know any of that yet. She just stood at the window and let herself feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the equation might be solvable, that there might be a way through. Outside, the fog rolled in off the water. The stars disappeared one by one, swallowed by the gray. Below the bluff, the waves kept coming, the way they always did, indifferent to everything except their own movement. And somewhere in the eastern wing of the house, a door that had always been closed to her was, for the first time, left slightly open. She noticed. She filed it away. And she went to sleep. The door in the eastern wing was open for exactly 48 hours before someone closed it again. Celine had walked past it 3 times in those 2 days, each time slowing without stopping, each time registering the darkness beyond the gap and the sounds that came from it. Voices, the occasional sharp report of something electronic, the particular quality of silence that follows an argument that's been interrupted rather than resolved. On the 3rd day it was closed again, and the seam between door and frame was back to being invisible. And she went to her 9 o'clock meeting with Valentino and said nothing about it. The meeting was in the study. There were 2 banker's boxes on the floor beside the desk, both filled with documentation and a second laptop already open to an interface she didn't recognize. Valentino was standing when she came in. Standing again, always standing. She had not once seen him enter a room and immediately sit down, and she'd started to understand this wasn't dominance signaling. It was something older and more structural than that. A man who'd learned to always be ready to move. He told her the interim financial director was a man named Ortega, who had been with the organization for 11 years and was reliable but not sophisticated. He told her that Ortega would brief her on the current state of the accounts and that she'd have 2 weeks to do a full structural assessment before they discussed the directorship in concrete terms. She asked about the Eastern Wing. He looked at her. What about it? The door was open. That happens sometimes. It hasn't happened before. He picked up a folder from the desk. Ortega will be here at 10. I'd suggest reviewing the top box before he arrives. She understood that she'd been redirected and filed that away too, and sat down and opened the top box. Ortega was a wide, deliberate man who wore his suits the way someone wears borrowed clothes. Technically correct, perpetually slightly wrong. He was not unfriendly. He was also not, as Valentino had assessed, sophisticated, which Celine understood within the first 15 minutes as a gentle understatement. Ortega managed the accounts the way a man manages a complicated piece of machinery. He's been shown how to operate without being told how it works. Correctly, carefully, with a rigid adherence to the procedures he'd been given and no capacity to adapt when those procedures met unexpected conditions. He also, within the first 40 minutes of their meeting, told her more than he probably should have about the internal politics of the organization's financial division. Not because he was indiscreet by nature, but because he was clearly a man who'd been holding things for a long time and who'd correctly identified her as someone who was both safe to tell and who would need to know eventually. Rafael De Luca had not worked alone. Celine kept her expression neutral when he said this. She was looking at a column of subsidiary account records, and she continued looking at it while she processed what Ortega had just said. Who? She said. Ortega shifted in his chair. There are 2 captains I have concerns about, Captain Marzin and Captain Reeves. Their operational accounts show pattern irregularities consistent with what you found in the main documentation. I haven't brought this to Mr. Vescari because... He stopped. Because you weren't sure it would be safe to, she said. He looked at her without answering, which was its own answer. She set the records down. How long have you known? 6 months, maybe 7, and you sat on it. I have a family, he said simply, and without defensiveness, the way a man states a fact he's made his peace with. She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood it. She thought about the gap between understanding something and forgiving it, a gap she'd been navigating her entire life, in different configurations. Send me everything you have on Marzin and Reeves, she said, quietly, through the internal encrypted system, not email. He nodded. He looked relieved in the way that people look relieved when they've transferred a weight rather than resolved it. After he left, she sat alone in the small conference room off the main corridor and thought about what it meant that Raphael hadn't been operating alone, what it meant for the scope of what she'd found, what it meant that 2 captains had been present in that meeting room on Thursday, watching her dismantle their operation, and had said nothing and shown nothing, and were presumably now calculating what to do about the woman who had just become a significant problem for them. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and noted it. She went to find Valentino. He was in the East Corridor when she found him. Not in the study, not in the reception rooms, but in the East Corridor, standing outside the reinforced doors of the Eastern Wing with a man she'd never seen before. A man whose bearing communicated military background and current occupation with the efficiency of a billboard. They were speaking in low, rapid voices that stopped when she came around the corner. Both of them looked at her. The unknown man's look lasted approximately 1 second before he filed her into a category and stopped looking at her, which was exactly the kind of dismissal that told her something important about where this organization was at that moment. She was on the inside, but not all the way inside. There was still a seam, still a threshold she hadn't crossed. Valentino's look was different. She'd learned his looks by this point, the assessment ones, the transactional ones, the one he used in meetings when he wanted someone to stop talking. The look he gave her now was the assessment one, but it had something under it she hadn't cataloged yet. Ortega's gone? He said. Yes. I need to talk to you. He said something to the other man in Italian that she didn't catch. The man nodded and moved past her down the corridor without acknowledgement. She watched him go. Marzin and Reeves, she said. Valentino's expression didn't change. That was its own answer. The same kind Ortega had given her, the kind that lives in the space where a denial should be. You knew, she said. I suspected. Since when? He looked at the wall beside her head. 4 months. She absorbed that. You've been watching them, trying to determine scope. Ortega's had documentation for 6 or 7 months that could have significantly accelerated that process, she said, keeping her voice even because she understood that even was the right register for this information. He didn't bring it to you because he was afraid. Valentino's jaw tightened, a small movement, controlled immediately. Ortega has a family and he was watching what happened to people who knew inconvenient things, she said. That's a rational response. You can be angry about it, or you can use it to understand how compromised the internal information flow is right now. He looked at her directly. How compromised? Significantly. If 2 captains were running parallel operations with Raphael for 7+ months, and your internal intelligence didn't catch it, there are either more people involved than we know, or the information network has structural failures that go beyond individual disloyalty. The corridor was quiet. From behind the reinforced doors, she could hear the faint sound of voices again, more than one, the back and forth of something being worked out. Who's in there? She said. People handling a situation. What situation? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he said something that surprised her, which was that it involved a cargo shipment that had been misdirected through a port contact she'd seen referenced in the subsidiary account records she'd been reviewing all morning. She said, That's connected to the Marzin account irregularities. The misdirection isn't random. It's a systematic route corruption that's been running alongside the financial extraction. Valentino went still in the particular way he went still when something landed differently than he'd expected. She said, I need the full operational records, not just financial, shipping manifests, route documentation, contact logs. If this runs deeper than the money, I can't map it with financial records alone. Those records don't leave the Eastern Wing. Then let me work in the Eastern Wing. The silence stretched. Behind the reinforced door, a voice rose briefly and then dropped. Tomorrow morning, he said. 6 o'clock. Mrs. Harrow will have clearance for you. She nodded. He turned back to the door. She was already moving back toward the main corridor when he said, without turning, Celine. She stopped. Marzin was at the meeting on Thursday, he said. He watched everything you presented. She knew this. She had known it since Ortega's name drop, and she'd been sitting with the weight of it since then. But hearing it said out loud in Valentino's voice had a different mass to it. I know, she said. He knows your value to me now. He also knows you're a liability to him. I know that too. A pause. Don't walk anywhere alone on the grounds after dark. She looked at his back. Was that concern, Mr. Vescari? He didn't answer. He pushed the door open and went through it, and it closed behind him. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the stone weight back in her stomach, heavier now, more specific in its geography. Then she walked back through the house to the library and sat down and continued working until the light outside the windows shifted from gray to gray-dark, and Mrs. Harrow appeared to tell her dinner was ready. She ate alone. She sat very straight and ate her food and did not let herself think about the way Valentino had said, "Don't walk anywhere alone," with exactly the same flat inflection he used for everything, and how, underneath the inflection, there had been something with temperature in it. She was done being careful in the old way. She wasn't sure what the new way looked like yet. 3 weeks moved through the estate like weather, variable, pressured, never quite resolved. She worked in the Eastern Wing every morning from 6 until noon, then in the library through the afternoon, building a picture that grew more detailed and more alarming with each layer she uncovered. The route corruption ran through 4 port contacts across Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. The financial extraction had a secondary channel she'd missed initially, buried in insurance claim patterns across a set of subsidiary LLCs that was genuinely elegant in its architecture. Someone had built this with care, with expertise, with the specific knowledge of how forensic accounting approaches reconstruction. Someone who understood accounting as well as she did. That thought settled in her chest like a coal. She worked around it and kept building. The tension in the house during those 3 weeks had a physical quality to it. She could feel it in the behavior of the security rotation, the way men who'd been professionally invisible became marginally more visible, the way conversations in corridors stopped slightly faster when she walked past. Valentino was present but occupied. She saw him in the Eastern Wing meetings, across the conference table, occasionally in the corridor late at night when she was coming back from the kitchen and he was coming from somewhere she didn't ask about. They talked every day, mostly about work, occasionally about other things, briefly, in the sideways manner of two people who've agreed without agreeing that certain territory is available for exploration, but neither wants to be the first to enter it. One night, 11 days after the East Wing clearance, she was working late in the library when he came in. Not for her, he came in for a book, which surprised her because she hadn't thought of him as someone who came to libraries for books rather than for documentation. He pulled something off the shelf near the window and glanced at her at the table with the laptop and the spread of physical records. "You should sleep," he said. "You should also sleep," she said, without looking up. A pause. She heard him move, not toward the door, toward the chair across the table from her. He sat down. She looked up. He had the book in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her with the expression she'd cataloged as the unknown one, the one she didn't have a category for yet. "The root corruption," she said. "There's a structural elegance to the secondary financial channel that bothers me." "Bothers you how?" "Someone built it who really knows financial architecture. Not just someone who's good with money, someone with formal training and specific knowledge of forensic reconstruction methodology. Meaning, they built it to survive exactly the kind of investigation I'm doing." He was quiet. "Raphael didn't build it," she said. Raphael's financial approach in the primary extraction was competent but not sophisticated. This is different. This is someone else's work. "Who?" "I don't know yet." She looked at him. "But they're still in the organization. The architecture is still active. Someone's still maintaining it." He set the book on the table. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and the light from the lamp between them caught the line of his jaw and the scar along it and the tiredness that lived permanently behind his eyes now. "The situation is more compromised than I thought when you arrived," he said. "Yes?" "The question is how far." "The question," she said carefully, "is whether this has been a coordinated long-term strategy or whether it evolved opportunistically." She paused. "Because those two things have very different implications for who's driving it." He looked at her. "If it's coordinated and long-term," she said, "then there's someone with a strategic objective, someone who wants something specific from this organization, not just money." "What would someone want," he said, "beyond money, leverage, control, or the organization itself?" The word itself sat between them. She watched him receive it, watched the way he processed it, without visible reaction, the way he'd been processing things for 37 years in a world where visible reaction was a liability. She was learning to read the processing, the micro-adjustments in the muscles around his eyes and jaw that stood in for what other people communicated with their whole faces. What she read now was that this wasn't new information, that he'd been thinking about this, that he'd been sitting with the shape of it and had not wanted it confirmed. "Reeves is leaving for Vancouver tomorrow," he said. "Business trip. 3 days." She waited. "I want you to review his personal account structure before he comes back," he said. "All of it. Not just the operational accounts, personal holdings, domestic accounts, anything you can access." "That's a significant scope expansion," she said. "Yes." "You're trusting me with that." He looked at her evenly. "That's what I said." She held the look. Outside the library windows, the Pacific was invisible in the dark, just sound. The low continuous percussion of water against rock, the same sound that had been under everything since she'd arrived. A sound she'd stopped noticing until moments like this when it came back to her like something remembered. "Valentino," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name directly. She'd been calling him Mr. Vescari in front of other people, and nothing at all in private. She'd been careful about that, had been navigating the distance with the same care she applied to everything. She watched the effect of it cross his face, small and controlled, like a stone thrown into still water. "What?" he said. If what I find in Reeves' accounts confirms the coordinated strategy theory, she said, this organization is in more danger than the Raphael situation represented. Significantly more. I know. What's the contingency? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You. She stared at him. The contingency, he said, is that someone with your specific skills and no loyalty to the old structure starts building a new one. He picked up the book, which is what you've been doing for 3 weeks, whether you understood that framing or not. He stood. He walked to the door. She said, I understood it. He stopped. I understood it from the first meeting, she said. I've been deciding whether the terms were acceptable. A pause, and his back was to her. And? She looked at the records spread across the table in front of her. The months of careful theft, the elegantly constructed machinery of betrayal, the cold precision of someone who'd spent years learning exactly how to hollow out something from the inside. So far, she said. He left. She sat alone in the library for a long time after, listening to the water, running the numbers that weren't financial, the ones that lived in the body and didn't resolve cleanly and kept coming back regardless of how many times she tried to close them out. Reeves left for Vancouver at 7 in the morning. Celine had his personal account access by 9:30. By noon, she wished she didn't. What she found was not a continuation of the pattern she'd already mapped. What she found was a different kind of architecture entirely, cleaner, more recent, structured around a set of holding entities incorporated in the Channel Islands over the last 8 months. And moving through those entities, in amounts large enough to be significant and structured carefully enough to avoid automatic flagging, was money that didn't come from Raphael's operation. Money that came from outside. She sat back from the laptop. Outside meant a third party. Outside meant this wasn't internal corruption, or not only internal corruption. Outside meant someone had been investing in the corrosion of Valentino's organization, paying for it, funding the infrastructure of its own destruction. She thought about the word she'd used last night, the organization itself. She picked up the encrypted phone Valentino had given her the second week and called the number. He picked up on the second ring. What? I need you to see something, she said. Now. Not tonight. Now. The pause on his end was brief. 10 minutes. She spent those 10 minutes documenting what she'd found in a format she could walk through quickly, organizing it from the most critical data point outward, the way she organized everything for presentation. Her hands were steady. She noticed this less now. The steadiness had stopped surprising her. It was just what her hands did. When Valentino came into the eastern wing, she showed him the Channel Islands entities first, then the inflows, then the timeline, which was the part that she'd been sitting with for 90 minutes and which she'd been building toward showing him because the timeline was where it stopped being abstract. The external funding of the internal coup had begun 26 months ago, 2 months before the current chief accountant had gone missing. She watched him absorb this. She watched the controlled stillness become something different, something that had pressure behind it, the kind of stillness that isn't calm but is its own form of held force. Someone bought it, he said. Someone bought the inside of my organization. Someone bought access to a coup, she said. They funded the infrastructure. They waited for the right moment. Who? She had a name. She'd found it 40 minutes ago in a registration document buried in the Channel Islands incorporation files. A document that should have been scrubbed but hadn't been. A name listed as authorized signatory on the parent entity. A name she recognized because she'd done enough research on the Pacific Northwest criminal ecosystem in the past 3 weeks to know who the major players were. She told him the name. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. She counted. When he spoke, his voice was exactly the same as it always was. Flat, controlled, inflectionless. But the muscles along his jaw were doing something she'd never seen them do before. Liang Wei, he said. His signature is on the parent entity authorization. It might be falsified. It's not falsified, Valentino said. She waited. Liang Wei has been trying to acquire Pacific Northwest port access for 4 years, he said. 3 direct approaches, all refused. He looked at the documentation on her screen. I should have anticipated this. You couldn't have known the methodology. I should have known the intent would find another method. He stepped back from the screen, ran a hand along the back of his neck. The first genuinely uncontrolled physical gesture she'd ever seen him make. It was small, and it lasted only a second, but it was unmistakably the motion of a man recalibrating under pressure, the human infrastructure showing through the professional one for just a moment. She looked away, because that moment felt private in a way she hadn't expected. "Reeves is in Vancouver," she said. "Yes." Liang Wei operates out of Vancouver. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was entirely readable this time. The assessment had resolved into something simpler and more combustible. "Call them," she said. "Bring him back." "If I bring him back, Wei knows we found the pipeline. If you don't bring him back, Reeves briefs Wei on everything that's happened in the last 2 weeks, including me." She paused. "Including what I've found." Valentino pulled the phone from his pocket. He made the call. She heard him speak, short, precise, without inflection. He gave 2 instructions and ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at the wall. "He'll be brought back tonight," he said. "And then?" "And then we find out how many others Wei has bought." The weight of it settled into the room between them. She felt the shape of it. Not panic, not exactly, but the specific sober recognition of a situation whose gravity had just significantly increased. She was not standing in a complicated employment negotiation anymore. She was standing in the middle of something that had the dimensions of a war. She thought about the conversation the night before. "The contingency is you." She thought about Marzin, sitting in the meeting room watching her dismantle Raphael, calculating behind his still face. She thought about the open door in the east corridor that had been carefully closed again. Her phone buzzed on the table beside the laptop. Unknown number. She showed it to Valentino. He looked at it. "Don't answer," he said. It buzzed 3 times and stopped. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again. This time a text. No contact name. 4 words. She read them. She felt the cold drop through her chest. The same sensation as that midnight hallway. The same specific temperature of something wrong. She turned the phone so he could read it. "You should have run." Valentino looked at the message. She watched him look at it. She watched the thing behind his eyes become something harder and more final than she'd seen before. He crossed the room in 3 steps and hit the security intercom on the wall. "Lockdown," he said. "Eastern Wing, full protocol." The response came immediately. Acknowledgement, movement, the sound of the house changing its posture around them. He turned to her. "Stay here." "What's happening?" "Stay here," he said again, and this time it wasn't an instruction, it was something else. Something that came from the part of him that was showing through the professional infrastructure, the part she'd glimpsed for a second in the uncontrolled gesture, the part that existed underneath. The lockdown hit the Eastern Wing like a physical thing, not loud, not dramatic, just a sudden hardening of the environment, the way pressure changes before a storm makes itself visible. Steel panels dropped across the external windows with a sound like a vault ceiling. The corridor lights shifted from white to a dim amber that turned everything the color of old photographs. Somewhere below them in the structure, Celine heard the mechanical language of security systems coming to full attention. Valentino was already moving toward the door. "What's happening outside?" she said. "I don't know yet." He pulled the door open. 2 of his security men were in the corridor, already repositioned, already with the stillness of people who've switched modes. He spoke to them quickly in Italian. One of them split off immediately. The other stayed at the door. "Valentino." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it. Flat, clear, no petition in it. He stopped. The text came from inside the grounds. The network it used is the internal encrypted system. He turned and looked at her. "Whoever sent it has access to your internal communications infrastructure," she said. "That's not an outside threat. That's someone in this building right now." The corridor was quiet except for the amber hum and the distant sound of the estate reconfiguring itself. She watched him absorb this, watched the controlled stillness become the held force version she'd identified in the library, the one that preceded decisions rather than following them. "Get away from the door," he said to her. She moved back toward the center of the room. He said something else to the remaining security man and pulled the door closed behind him, and she was alone in the Eastern Wing with the amber light and the locked windows and the documentation spread across the table showing her, in precise numerical language, exactly how thoroughly someone had been preparing to destroy this place. She sat down. She picked up the encrypted phone. The text was still on the screen. You should have run. Past tense. Not a warning. A verdict. She turned the phone face down on the table and pulled the laptop toward her and kept working, because working was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was outside her control, and because the documentation on the screen was the only weapon she currently possessed, and she intended to know every inch of it. 22 minutes later, the door opened, and it wasn't Valentino. It was Marzin. She knew his face from the Thursday meeting. Mid-50s, compact, a face that had the texture of someone who'd spent decades maintaining an expression of mild pleasantness over something entirely different. He was wearing a suit. He had two men behind him she'd never seen, which meant they weren't Valentino's regular security rotation. She didn't stand up. "Ms. Mercer," he said pleasantly. Her hands were flat on the table. She could feel the edge of the laptop under her left palm. She did not move them. "Captain Marzin." He came into the room. His men stayed at the door. He looked at the documentation on the table without appearing to look at it. The practiced peripheral assessment of someone who'd spent a career gathering information while appearing to do something else. "Where's Vescari?" he said. "I don't know. That's unfortunate." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, mirroring her position with a deliberateness that was its own form of communication. "We were hoping to resolve this quickly." "Resolve what?" "The transition," he said. He said it the way you say a word that has a specific technical meaning in a specific context, the way accountants say reconciliation or lawyers say settlement. A word doing heavy work in a small space. She looked at him steadily. "There's no transition occurring." "There is," he said. "It's been in progress for some time. You've actually been quite helpful in accelerating the timeline, which we appreciate." He smiled. The pleasantness on his face had separated from his eyes entirely now, like a mask that's been worn so long it moves on its own. "What you found about the Channel Islands entities, that was impressive, faster than we expected." She heard what was underneath that sentence. She let it land fully before she responded. "You expected me to find it." "We hoped you would. The documentation trail was, let's say it was left in a findable condition." The cold drop again, but different this time. Not fear exactly, something more specific. The feeling of standing on ground you thought was solid and feeling it shift. "You needed Vescari to know about Liang Wei," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "You needed him to believe the external threat was the primary threat. While the internal restructuring proceeded," Marzin said. "Yes." She looked at the documentation in front of her. All those weeks of work, the careful reconstruction, the cross-referenced evidence, the timeline she'd been so precisely proud of, built from data that had been curated for her, led through a maze whose architecture she hadn't questioned because the evidence was real. The money was real. The shell entities were real. Liang Wei's signature was real. "Is Wei involved?" she said. "Weiqi is a competitor who has made several legitimate approaches to acquire port access and been refused," Marzin said. "His name on that document is not falsified, but his involvement in this specific operation is..." A small pause. "Overstated." She sat with that. "Vescari went to pull Reeves back from Vancouver," she said. "He's focusing his response on the external threat." "Yes." "Which means the internal security redeployment is..." "Exactly where we need it to be," Marzin said. "Away from the Western approach. Away from the server infrastructure. Away from the 3 access points that matter tonight." She looked at him across the table. The amber light was unkind to his face. It showed the structure under the pleasant surface. The harder thing, the patient thing, the thing that had been sitting behind Captain Marzin's mild expression for however many years he'd been building toward this night. "Raphael," she said. "He wasn't the architect. Raphael was useful, greedy and useful and ultimately expendable." He picked up the edge of one of the physical documents from the table, glanced at it, set it back. The financial extraction was genuine. He did steal that money. He simply did it with our assistance and our methodology, which is why the architecture was more sophisticated than his own capabilities would have suggested. She thought about sitting in the library, running her hands over the elegance of the secondary channel, thinking this is someone else's work. She'd been right. She just hadn't understood what that meant. "You used me," she said. "Not with anger." with the flat precision she used for accurate statements. "We used your skills," he said, "which is different. You're extraordinarily competent, Ms. Mercer. The Thursday presentation was genuinely impressive. It accomplished everything we needed it to. Removed Raphael, consolidated Vescari's trust in you, positioned you as the primary financial intelligence asset." He looked at her with something that might have been genuine professional regard if everything around it weren't what it was. "The phone you're holding is connected to our network, not Vescari's. Has been since the second week. Everything you've sent through it, everything you've accessed through the Eastern Wing systems, we have it all." She looked at the phone on the table in front of her, face down. The encrypted phone Valentino had given her on the second week. She thought about every conversation she'd sent through it, every document, every piece of the financial reconstruction she'd transmitted to his secure server. She thought about the conversation last night in the library, the 10-minute phone call Valentino had made to have Reeves brought back. The two instructions, precise and brief, the whole response structure of his security organization redirecting itself based on a threat she had handed him. That she had been handed. Her chest was doing something complicated. She kept her face still. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Cooperation," he said. "Specifically, your signature on a set of financial instruments authorizing the transfer of operational control of the primary account structures to a new directorship, combined with your access credentials for the Eastern Wing systems." He paused. "The transfer has already been initiated. Your signature makes it clean. Your credentials make it complete. And if I don't?" He looked at her without the smile now. The pleasant surface had been retired for this part of the conversation. What was underneath it was not cruel. She would almost have preferred cruelty, which was at least emotional. What was underneath was simply practical. The face of a man who has thought through the decision tree and is presenting the relevant branches. "Then the operation proceeds without your cooperation," he said, "which is messier for everyone." She said, "Where's Valentino?" "Being managed." The words hit her somewhere specific, not in the chest this time, lower, more physical, the gut response to something that bypassed language. "Define managed," she said. "He's alive," Marzin said. "But for now, that's a variable with some flexibility." She looked at the table, at her hands flat on the surface, at the edge of the laptop under her left palm. She thought with the cold, systematic clarity she'd always had under maximum pressure, the part of her that didn't shake, that inventoried, that built from what was known toward what was possible. Known, the security deployment had been manipulated. Known, the communications infrastructure was compromised. Known, Marzin had at minimum 2 additional men at the door and unknown numbers elsewhere in the estate. Known, Valentino had gone into a situation believing the primary threat was external and was now somewhere in this building with that belief intact. Possible, he was still operational. Possible, there was still time. Variable, what she did in the next 30 seconds. "I need to see him," she said, "before I sign anything." Marzin looked at her. "That's my condition," she said. "Non-negotiable. I sign after I see him." A pause. He was assessing her the way she'd been assessing him, running the decision tree, looking for the play inside the condition. She kept her face neutral and her hands flat and gave him nothing to read except the statement itself. "5 minutes," he said. "You see him. Then we proceed." He stood. She stood. She left the laptop on the table because taking it would tell him something about her intentions, and she needed him to believe her intentions were toward cooperation until they weren't. She was walked out of the Eastern Wing at the center of a 4-man formation. Marzin ahead, 2 men beside her, 1 behind. Through the reinforced door and into the main corridor, which had the amber emergency lighting throughout now, the whole house reconfigured into its crisis geometry. They went down 2 levels via the internal staircase to the lower floor, the floor she'd known about in theory, the underground corridor level she'd found the seam to on day 3 and filed away and not returned to. The corridors down here were narrower, concrete rather than marble, a different register of the building entirely, functional, utilitarian, the infrastructure beneath the architecture. She paid attention to everything, the turns, the distances, the location of the security panels on the walls, the cameras at the corridor junctions, the weight and position of the men around her. They stopped at a door. Marzin keyed it open. Valentino was inside. He was standing. Of course he was standing. He was always standing, even now, even here, in the center of a room that was bare except for a chair he hadn't used and two men positioned at opposite walls. His jacket was gone. There was blood on his shirt near his left shoulder, fresh, spreading. He'd been shot or cut in the past hour, and he was managing it the same way he'd managed the knife wound in the kitchen, with total controlled stillness, the pain locked behind his jaw and his eyes. He looked at her when she came in. His expression did several things in rapid sequence, all of them controlled back to neutral within a second, but she'd learned to read him and she read them. First, the assessment. Was she hurt? What was her status? And then something underneath that, the human infrastructure showing through, something that wasn't professional and wasn't controlled and lasted exactly the length of a blink before he put it away. "You all right?" he said. His voice was flat. "Yes." She crossed to him. Marzin let her. She was 2 steps inside the room before she registered that he'd let her cross without stopping her, which told her something about how thoroughly he'd mapped out this scenario and how little he considered her a physical threat. She stopped in front of Valentino and looked at the shoulder. "How bad?" "Manageable." "You keep using that word?" "Because I keep being right about it." She looked at his face. She was standing close enough that she could speak quietly and not be heard clearly from the door. She kept her expression at neutral cooperation, the face of a woman doing what she'd been told to do, and she said in a voice that barely moved the air between them, "The threat is internal, not Wei. The security redeployment was manipulated. The phone they gave me, everything went to them." She watched him receive this. She watched the recalibration happen in real time, faster than she'd seen him recalibrate anything. The whole architecture of his understanding of the past 3 hours restructuring itself in the span of 2 seconds. His jaw tightened once and released. "The server room," he said at the same volume. "They need my access credentials and my signature on transfer instruments," she said. "They haven't moved yet. The operation is still waiting on me." "How long?" "Minutes, maybe less." He looked at her. The thing she'd been cataloging as unknown, the one she'd never fully categorized, was fully visible now, stripped of its professional context, and she understood finally what it was. Not assessment, not transaction. The specific quality of attention that a person gives to the thing they've decided matters. "Don't sign," he said. "I know." "Whatever they threaten, I know," she said again. Marzin's voice from the door. "That's enough." She didn't move immediately. She stayed for one more second looking at Valentino's face in the amber light, at the controlled damage in it, at the scar along his jaw and the blood spreading at his shoulder, and the eyes that were giving her something she hadn't been given in so long, she'd half convinced herself she didn't need it. Then she turned back toward Marzin. "I'll sign," she said. Valentino said nothing behind her. She heard the quality of his silence, the same held force, the same pressure behind the stillness. And she walked back to the door and let Marzin lead her out of the room and back into the corridor. The door closed behind her. She had no plan. She had components, variables, constants, a set of known facts about the physical layout of this building and the operational structure of the organization and the specific architecture of the financial systems she'd been living inside for 3 weeks. She had the thing her father had told her when she was 9 years old, sitting at a kitchen table. Numbers just say what is. She had what she'd always had. She walked through the concrete corridor with 4 men around her and the amber light above her, and the sound of the building doing what Marzin needed it to do. All its systems pointed in the wrong direction, and she thought about the server room in the Eastern Wing sublevel, the one she'd identified on day 4 of her Eastern Wing access, the one that housed the financial network architecture, the one that Marzin needed her credentials to access, the one that was, by her calculation, 1 floor above and 40 meters east of where she was right now. She thought about $68 million sitting in accounts that were about to be transferred out of Valentino's control and into whatever structure Marzin had spent 2 years building. She thought about what it would mean to redirect rather than stop. The idea arrived whole, not gradually, whole, complete, the way the best solutions always arrived, with the clean inevitability of something that had been waiting for its moment. It was not a safe idea. It was not a careful idea. It was the kind of idea that the old Celine, the careful Celine, the Celine who'd spent 11 years trying to stay small enough to avoid consequences, would never have entertained. That woman no longer existed. They were at the staircase now, going up. The eastern wing access was one level above. Marzin said, "The transfer instruments are prepared. We'll go to the financial terminal first, then the server room for the credentials." "All right," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. Her heart was doing something loud and sustained in her chest that she was managing through the simple, sustained act of not thinking about it. One level up, 40 meters east, a server room and a financial terminal and $68 million, and whatever she was going to become on the other side of the next 10 minutes. She thought about the text on her phone. "You should have run." She thought about standing in a midnight alley in her bare feet, watching taillights disappear. She'd stopped running. She climbed the stairs. And somewhere in the concrete infrastructure of the building below her, in a bare room with an unused chair, a man who had given her one instruction, "Don't sign," and one look that she was going to have to think about later, was bleeding slowly into his shirt. The financial terminal was in a room off the Eastern Wing's main corridor, a room she'd worked in every morning for 3 weeks, a room she knew the way she knew her own breathing, every surface and outlet, and the specific sound the ventilation made when the external temperature dropped below 40 degrees. Marzin walked her in. 2 men stayed at the door. One stayed beside her. The transfer instruments were on the table. Physical documents, not digital. 6 pages of legal architecture that represented the operational control transfer of the primary account structures. Someone had spent time on these. The language was precise. The structure was legitimate on its face, the kind of documentation that would survive scrutiny from the outside because it had been built by someone who understood how scrutiny worked. She stood in front of them and looked at them and did not pick up the pen. "Ms. Mercer," Marzin said. "I'm reading them," she said. She was not reading them. She was looking at the terminal across the room, the one currently displaying the financial network interface, the one that showed the transfer queue Marzin had initialized, $68 million sitting in a holding pattern waiting for her credentials to release it. She was also looking at the ventilation panel on the east wall, the one she'd noticed on day 6 because the screws were misaligned, the kind of misalignment that happens when a panel has been opened and replaced in a hurry by someone who wasn't thinking about the screws. She was looking at the distance between the table and the terminal, 11 feet. She was looking at the man beside her, his position, his weight distribution, the angle of his body, the hand nearest her, and whether it was relaxed or ready. It was relaxed. Marzin had mapped this scenario as cooperative. He'd given her the 5 minutes with Valentino as a concession to her stated condition, which meant he'd assessed her as a woman who needed emotional reassurance before compliance. That assessment was wrong, and it was going to cost him approximately 45 seconds of response time, which was all she needed. She picked up the pen. She looked at the first page of the documents. She said, "There's a structural error on page 3. The authorization chain skips the intermediate signatory requirement under the organizational bylaws. If this is challenged later, it'll fail." Marzin said, "It won't be challenged." "You don't know that." She turned to page 3, ran her finger down the authorization structure with the deliberate focus of someone doing their job. "The intermediate signatory is the financial director, which is currently, under the terms of my negotiated arrangement, me. Meaning this document requires my signature in 2 places, not 1. Here, at the bottom of page 3, and at the end." A pause. She heard Marzin move slightly, the small adjustment of someone who hadn't expected a procedural complication and was recalculating whether it was genuine or tactical. It was tactical, but it was also genuinely correct, which was the thing she'd learned about the most effective misdirections. They worked best when they were true. "Fine," he said. "Sign page 3 first." She flipped to page 3. She bent over the document with the pen. The man beside her shifted his weight slightly forward to watch her sign. She dropped the pen. It hit the floor and rolled under the table. Reflex. The man beside her glanced down. 1 second, the weight still forward. She didn't think. She moved. 11 feet to the terminal in 3 seconds, shoulder hitting the table edge as she went. Pain flaring bright along her right arm and, irrelevant, both hands on the keyboard before anyone in the room had fully registered that she'd moved, fingers pulling up the transfer queue because she'd been working in this system for 3 weeks, and she knew where everything lived the way she knew her own name. The shout behind her was Marzin's voice, sharp and stripped of the pleasantness entirely. She didn't look. Her fingers moved. The transfer queue was open. $68 million in 17 discrete tranches, all initialized and waiting. Destination accounts. The Channel Islands entities she'd mapped. Marzin's architecture. The structure that had been 2 years in the building. She pulled up the destination field. Her hands were shaking now. Not with fear, with adrenaline, with the specific physical cost of the decision she was making, the thing she'd thought of in the corridor and was now executing without the safety of thinking about it anymore. A hand closed on her shoulder and yanked. She grabbed the edge of the terminal with both hands and held on. The man was strong, pulling her backward, her feet leaving the floor, the screen tilting away from her. Her right hand found the keyboard. 3 keystrokes. 4. She redirected the first tranche. The hand yanked harder. She lost the keyboard. Her back hit the floor and the impact drove the air out of her in a single hard exhale, and she lay there for 1 second with the fluorescent light above her and the amber emergency glow underneath it, and the specific gray of a world that had had the oxygen knocked out of it. Marzin was standing over her. His face had completed its transformation. No surface left, no pleasantness, nothing but the operational thing underneath. "Get her up," he said. They got her up. She stood. Her shoulder where she'd hit the table was screaming. She looked at the terminal screen over the man's shoulder. First tranche redirected. $68 million minus $4.2 million. Still $63.8 million to go. Marzin looked at the screen. He looked at her. His voice when he spoke was very quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. "What account did you send it to?" She said nothing. "What account?" "One you don't have access to," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to the man beside her, "Take her to the server room. She gives us the access credentials and she reverses what she just did, in that order." He turned to the second man at the door. "Tell the team to accelerate the timeline. We're not waiting anymore." She was walked out. Behind her she heard Marzin on a phone, his voice low and rapid, and she heard the word now repeated twice, and she understood that the 45 seconds she'd bought had been enough to change the shape of what was happening, but not enough to stop it. The estate was accelerating around her. She could hear it. Footsteps in corridors that shouldn't have had footsteps. The distant percussion of something happening outside the western approach, and underneath all of it, the mechanical language of the security system that had been pointed in the wrong direction. All its attention on an external threat that was smaller than advertised, while the real threat walked through the interior unchallenged. She was in the corridor. Server room was 20 meters ahead. The man holding her arm was the one who'd pulled her off the terminal. Bigger than the others, purposeful, not rough but not gentle either. The grip of someone who'd revised their category for her from cooperative to controlled. She was calculating. The server room had biometric access, her handprint and retinal scan. Once she was inside, they needed her body to complete the credential sequence. Until she completed it, she was alive and necessary. The window between they need me and they don't need me anymore was the only window she had. She needed Valentino. She didn't know where he was or what condition he was in, or whether the man she'd left bleeding slowly into his shirt in a bare concrete room had any way of knowing what was happening 2 levels above him. She needed 30 seconds at the server room terminal alone. She had a handprint and a retinal scan and absolutely no leverage. She thought about the ventilation panel with the misaligned screws. She thought about the Eastern Wing sublevel, the underground corridor she'd found on day 3, the seam in the library wall, the layout she'd mapped systematically and never stopped mapping because that was how she moved through the world, building the picture, understanding the infrastructure, knowing where everything was before she needed to know. The server room door was ahead. Biometric panel on the right side. The man holding her arm positioned her in front of the panel. "Handprint first," he said. She looked at the panel. She looked at the camera above the door. The security camera that fed to the monitoring station in the Western security room. The station that was currently staffed by Marzin's people rather than Valentino's because the redeployment had pulled the regular rotation away from the interior. She looked at the camera and she thought about the monitoring station, and she thought about whether anyone in this building was still watching the feeds. She put her hand on the panel. The light went green. The first credential accepted. She leaned toward the retinal scanner. The door opened. Not because of her retinal scan. Chepet. The door opened from the inside, swinging out fast, and the man holding her arm had approximately 1 second to register that something was wrong before the door hit him, and he went sideways and the grip on her arm broke, and she was moving before she understood what was happening. Valentino came through the door. He looked terrible. He looked like a man who'd been shot and had done something inadvisable to stop bleeding long enough to move. The shoulder wound now wrapped with what looked like his own jacket sleeve. His shirt dark and his face the color she'd seen in the kitchen that first night. Gray at the edges, managed in the center. He had a weapon in his right hand and his left arm was held slightly wrong. The shoulder not fully operational, but his right hand was completely steady. She stopped. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for the 1 second it took to establish that they were both upright. Then there was no more time for anything except what came next. The man who'd been holding her was getting up. Another man appeared at the corridor junction ahead. Valentino moved, not toward the threat, toward her, one hand on her arm pulling her through the server room door, and she went because through was the right direction. Through was where the terminal was. Through was where the only place she had left lived. The door closed. He put his back against it. "How many?" he said. Marzin had 4 with him upstairs, unknown number on the western approach. She was already at the terminal, already logging in, hands moving. "How did you get here?" "The sublevel corridor, same way you found the eastern wing on day 3. A pause. "You weren't subtle about that. You knew I found it. I know everything that happens in my house." His voice was strained in a way that told her the managed gray at the edges of his face was costing him something significant. "What are you doing?" "Finishing what I started at the financial terminal," she said. "I redirected 1 tranche, 4.2 million. I need to redirect the rest." "How long?" 3 minutes if nobody opens that door. Less if you tell me right now whether you have anyone left in this building who is actually yours." A sound from the other side of the door. Not a knock. The sound of someone taking a position, settling weight. 1 person, maybe 2, waiting for reinforcement or instruction. 2 men, he said. Sub-level. I sent them to the security monitoring station. The station Marzin's people took over. They took it back. A brief pause. It was not a quiet process. She pulled up the transfer queue. $63.8 million in 16 remaining tranches, all still in holding pattern, all still waiting for the credential release she had not given them. The destination accounts were still Marzin's Channel Islands architecture. She started changing destinations. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same controlled speed she'd used every day for 3 weeks in this room, the speed that lived in muscle memory now, the system's architecture as familiar as her own handwriting. Each tranche required a destination override and an authorization code, and she had both because she'd built this access herself and she knew every corner of it. Behind her, Valentino said, "They're going to breach that door in approximately 90 seconds. I need 120. Then I need you to work faster." "I'm working as fast as it's possible to work," she said, without turning around, fingers still moving. "Talk to me about something else." A beat of silence. Then, from behind her, with the same flat inflection he used for everything, "You redirected $4 million to an unknown account in the middle of an armed takeover." "Yes." "Without a plan for what came after." "I had a general direction." Tranche 4 redirected. Tranche 5. "I'm better with numbers than contingencies." "That's not true," he said. "I've watched you run contingencies for 8 weeks." "I was running contingencies for someone else's situation," she said. "This is mine. It's different." Tranche 6, 7. The progress bar on the transfer interface was moving, slowly, because each redirect had to process through the network handshake before the next one could initiate, and the network handshake took 4 seconds per tranche, and 16 tranches times 4 seconds was 64 seconds minimum, and she did not have 64 seconds. The door moved. Not open. Moved. The specific shudder of something heavy being applied to it from the other side, testing the resistance. Valentino repositioned, putting more weight against it, and she heard the cost of that in his breath. A sharp, controlled exhale that he managed back to steady in under a second, but that she heard in the part of her that had been cataloging him for 8 weeks. "How many more?" he said. 9 tranches. 51 million. Another impact against the door. Harder. "Celine." She didn't stop typing. "I hear you." "If they get through that door, Gay." "I hear you," she said again. "Keep it closed." The processing bar crawled. 8 tranches. 7. Each redirect taking 4 seconds of network handshake, 4 seconds of her staring at a progress indicator and keeping her hands ready for the next input, 4 seconds during which the door behind her shuddered and held and shuddered again. She was sweating. She could feel it at her hairline and between her shoulder blades and in the specific way her shirt was sticking to the small of her back, the physical testimony of a body that was managing more than it wanted to. Her right shoulder was a sustained sharp note from where she'd hit the table and she was ignoring it comprehensively. 6 tranches. 5. A crack from the door. Not the shudder of impact, the specific sound of something structural giving. The door frame beginning to lose the argument. Valentino said one word. Her name. The way he'd said it in the library. That first time when it had done something to the air between them. But different now. Not with the quality of distance being tested, with the quality of someone who has stopped testing distance and made a decision about it. She didn't turn around. She couldn't turn around. Her hands were on the keyboard and 4 tranches remained and the processing bar was moving and she was the only thing standing between Marzin's 2-year architecture and the $63 million that was the blood supply of everything in this building. When this is done, she said, we're going to have a conversation. A pause. Despite everything, the door, the blood, the amber light, the $51 million in transit, she heard something that might have been the corner of his mouth moving. Looking forward to it, he said. 3 tranches. 2. The door cracked open 2 inches. She heard voices through the gap, heard Valentino push back, heard the specific sound of a man operating past his physical limit and not stopping. 1 tranche. The processing bar moved through its final 4 seconds at the speed of water uphill. She hit execute. The screen changed. The transfer queue cleared. $63.8 million plus the original 4.2, the entire operational reserve of Valentino Vescari's financial architecture, $68 million total, redirected in full into an account that Marzin had no access to, no knowledge of, and no ability to reach. An account she'd built herself, under a shell entity she'd incorporated on day 19 of her Eastern Wing access, using the methodology she'd reverse-engineered from the elegantly constructed secondary channel that someone on Marzin's side had built to survive forensic investigation. She'd built it to survive the same scrutiny. She had thought of it as a contingency. She'd thought about it the same way she thought about the ventilation panel with the misaligned screws and the sub-level corridor and the location of every security camera in the Eastern Wing. One more piece of the picture, one more element of knowing the infrastructure before she needed to know it. She pushed back from the terminal and turned around. The door was open 4 inches. Valentino had one hand on the edge of it and his back braced against the frame, and his face was the kind of gray that had stopped being manageable. The kind of gray that was making real-time demands that the will was not going to be able to override for much longer. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not relief. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as relief but was made of different material. Something that acknowledged more than the immediate crisis. Then the door opened fully. 3 men. Not Marzin. Marzin's men, the ones from the western approach, bigger than the pair who'd been in the corridor, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this before in spaces like this one. Valentino was knocked aside on the first contact, the injured shoulder meeting the doorframe with a sound she felt in her own body, and he went down to one knee and came back up because he was who he was. But the time that took was enough. She was grabbed before she could reach the terminal again. The room was suddenly too full of people, and too loud and too bright. The overhead lights having come on at some point she hadn't noticed. The amber emergency glow replaced by fluorescent exposure that showed everything with unkind clarity. The man holding her was not gentle this time. Her arm was behind her back at an angle that said, "Stop moving." In language the body understood without translation. She stopped moving. Valentino was upright. Barely. 2 men on him, one with a weapon at his side. He was looking at her with the expression she'd cataloged over 8 weeks distilled to its irreducible element. No professional surface, no transactional frame, just the thing underneath it all, the thing she'd named on the floor of the server room and would have to think about later if there was a later. Marzin walked in. He looked at the terminal. He looked at the cleared transfer queue. He looked at her. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It lost the flatness. What moved into the space where the flatness had been was something hot and structural, the specific expression of a man who has been precise and patient for 2 years and has just watched the entire architecture of that precision come apart in 3 minutes. He walked to the terminal and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. "Where is it?" he said. She said nothing. He turned to her, said to it, "Where did you send it?" She looked at him. Her arm was at a bad angle and her shoulder was screaming, and the fluorescent light was doing nothing kind to anyone in this room, and she could hear Valentino's breathing from across the space, controlled and steady, and costing him more than he had left to spend. She said, "Somewhere you'll never find it." Marzin looked at her with the hot structural thing still moving in his face, and then he said to the man holding her, "Bring her!" And to the men holding Valentino, "Bring him!" And he walked out of the server room, and they were walked after him through the corridor and up the stairs and into the main level of the house, which was no longer the house she'd been living in for 8 weeks. It was full of men she didn't recognize. The regular staff were absent. The security rotation was gone. The marble and glass and Pacific-facing windows, and the library with her chair by the window, and the study where she'd sat across a desk from a man who'd started as a transaction and become something else. All of it was occupied by people who moved through it like they'd already taken possession. They were walked to the entrance hall. Marzin stopped. He turned to face them. "The money will be found," he said. "Every account in every jurisdiction will be frozen while it's looked for, and the operational paralysis that causes will accomplish what the transfer was meant to accomplish." He said it without the hot structural thing now. It had passed through and left something colder. "The outcome is the same. It just takes longer." Valentino said nothing. He was standing straight, the injured arm held slightly wrong, the gray at the edges of his face making real-time demands he was still refusing. Marzin looked at Celine. "You're exceptionally skilled," he said. "I meant that when I said it earlier. In another configuration, this would have gone differently." She held his look. "But right now," he said, "you are standing in the entrance hall of an estate that is no longer his, with $68 million in an account that is unreachable, and no path out of this building that I haven't already covered." The entrance hall was quiet. Through the windows, the Pacific was doing what it always did. Gray and enormous and indifferent, the fog rolling in off the water, the kind of visibility that collapsed distance. She looked at the windows. She looked at the security panel on the wall to her left. The one she'd cataloged on day 2 because it was positioned unusually, closer to the entrance than standard panic system architecture would suggest, which had nagged at her until day 11 when she'd found the reference to it in the Eastern Wing operational documentation. The master override panel, the one that interfaced with the estate's full security infrastructure, including the panic bunker below the Western Foundation. She looked at Valentino. He was looking at her. His eyes moved from her face to the panel and back, and she watched the recognition happen. The same rapid restructuring she'd seen in the concrete room when she'd given him the real situation in 12 seconds. The thing she'd watched his mind do when it was running at full speed despite everything the body was doing. He gave her nothing. No nod, no signal, nothing that Marzin or his men could read. Just the look, the one she'd named on the floor of the server room. She took one breath. Felt it fill her chest. In through the nose, slow. The man holding her arm shifted his weight. A small movement, a fraction of inattention, the body's unconscious response to a moment of apparent stillness. She stopped waiting. She drove her elbow back into his solar plexus with every pound she had behind it, felt the grip break in the half-second of his exhale, and she moved, 3 steps to the panel, both palms flat against it, and she hit the master override sequence she'd memorized off the operational documentation on day 14, without knowing why she was memorizing it, except that it was a thing that existed, and she made a practice of knowing things that existed. The estate exploded with sound. Every alarm, every lock, every security protocol the building had firing simultaneously, the kind of total system response that was designed for one specific contingency, the contingency where everything else had already failed. Marzin was shouting. She couldn't hear the words in the noise. She felt someone grab at her and miss, felt her own body moving with a momentum she didn't entirely feel like she was directing, felt the noise and the light and the surreal orchestral chaos of a building making every decision at once. And she felt Valentino's hand close around her wrist. Not grabbing, not dragging. The specific grip of someone who has made a decision about a direction and is communicating it through the single point of contact, pulling her through the entrance hall toward the western corridor, toward the place the documentation had said the panic bunker access was, toward the last remaining option in a building that had run out of... The panic bunker door was 6 inches of reinforced steel set into the western foundation wall, and it opened with a sound like the world sealing itself shut. Valentino pulled her through. She went. Behind them, the entrance hall was chaos. Alarms still running, lights cycling through their emergency sequence, the sound of men shouting over the noise, and the particular crashing percussion of furniture being knocked aside by people moving fast in a space that had become unfamiliar. She heard a shot. 1, then 2. She didn't know whose. The bunker door closed. The sound cut off like a switch thrown. One moment the world was all noise and motion and the specific smell of a building in crisis. Smoke and sweat and the electronic burn of overloaded systems. Then silence. The profound, pressurized silence of a sealed space below ground, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that you feel against your eardrums. The emergency lighting inside was red, low and even in red, casting everything in the color of old warning signals. The bunker was small, 12 feet by 15, a steel shelf with emergency supplies along one wall, a communication terminal on the second wall, a bench along the third. The fourth wall was solid foundation concrete. She stood with her back against the closed door and breathed. Valentino was already moving to the communication terminal, his right hand working the panel, his left arm held at the specific angle that said, "I am not using this in language," the body spoke clearly. She watched him move and cataloged what she saw. The gray at the edges of his face had deepened, the managed quality of it thinner now, the thing underneath it closer to the surface. The jacket sleeve improvised around his shoulder was dark, and had been dark for a while. "You need to stop moving," she said. "I need to reach my people first." "Your people or Marzin's people in your people's positions?" He stopped at the terminal and looked at her. The red light did nothing kind to either of them. It showed everything. The damage, the exhaustion, the 8 weeks of what they'd built, and what the last 3 hours had tried to dismantle. "Kate's," he said. "He runs the eastern perimeter. He's been with me 17 years. If anyone in this building is still mine, it's Kate's. Call him." He turned back to the terminal. She crossed the bunker and stood beside him and looked at the communication interface. Older system, hardwired, not connected to the network that Marzin's people had compromised. Analog in a digital building, which was exactly the kind of redundancy that someone with Valentino's history would have built in and never advertised. He raised Kate's on the third attempt. The voice that came through was rough and immediate and had gunfire in the background that it was clearly working to sound calm over. Kate's was on the eastern perimeter. He had 4 men. He'd been running a counter-incursion since the alarms fired, and he'd taken the monitoring station back. Not the one Valentino had mentioned before, a secondary one that Marzin's redeployment hadn't fully accounted for because it wasn't on the standard security map. She listened to them talk and did the math. Marzin had come in with enough force to take the estate, but not enough to hold it against a sustained counter-response. He'd planned on a quick transfer and a quick exit, the operation designed for speed, not durability. The 68 million redirected and the alarms triggered had broken the timeline. He was now holding a building he'd intended to pass through, with a counterforce closing from the east and a hardened bunker on the western side that he couldn't breach without equipment he hadn't brought. She said to Valentino, "He needs to move on the main entrance from the east while Marzin's attention is on the bunker door." He relayed this. She listened to Kate's acknowledgement and the background noise shift, the particular quality of men receiving a direction and moving. Valentino ended the communication and stood at the terminal with his hand on the panel and his head dropped slightly. The first time she'd seen his head drop under its own weight. The first time the managed vertical line of him had acknowledged what the body was doing. She moved to the supply shelf, found the medical kit, well stocked, organized with the same competence as everything else in this building. She brought it to where he was standing. "Sit down," she said. He turned and looked at her. "There's nothing else you can do from in here until Kate's clears the entrance," she said. "Sit down and let me look at that shoulder." He sat on the bench. She knelt in front of him and worked the improvised binding off his shoulder and looked at what was underneath. The red light made assessment difficult, but not impossible. The wound was a through and through on the outer shoulder. Bad, meaningful, the kind of thing that required real medical attention. But it had missed the structures that would have put him on the floor hours ago. He was upright and functional because the damage was to the perimeter rather than the center, and because he was who he was. And he decided to keep moving and had continued deciding that on a rolling basis for the past several hours. She packed it properly from the kit and bound it with what was available and did the job the way she'd done it the first time in the kitchen, with focus and steady hands and the part of her that went quiet when there was something concrete and solvable in front of it. He watched her work. She could feel him watching. The red light and the silence and the sealed door quality of the space made the watching feel different than it did above ground. More direct, less mediated by the professional architecture they'd both been maintaining around themselves for 8 weeks. "The account," he said. "Offshore," she said. "Channel Islands, same jurisdiction as Marzin's entities. Incorporated on day 19. I used the methodology from his secondary channel architecture, so it has the same forensic resistance profile." She taped the final binding. "The transfer cleared before they pulled me off the terminal. All 68 million. Under what entity?" She looked up at him. "One I control." A pause. "I redirected it to save it," she said, "not to take it." "I know." "You don't know that. You have my word, which is, I know," he said again. His voice was flat and certain, the same voice he used for things that weren't questions. "I've watched you work for 8 weeks. I know the difference between what you were doing and theft." She held his look for a moment. The red light. The silence. The sound of her own pulse in her ears, which had been the soundtrack to the last 3 hours, and was only now beginning to slow. "When Cates clears the entrance," she said, "you're going to need a hospital." "After," he said. "Valentino. After," he said. "First I need to look Marzin in the face." She understood this. She didn't like it. She understood it. She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the red light and thought about what she wanted to say, and then decided on honesty, which was what she always decided on eventually. It just sometimes took her longer to get there. "When I was in the corridor," she said, "before they took me to the server room, I had a thought about redirecting the money, about what it would take and whether I could do it and what it would mean if I did." He was listening. "The thought I had," she said, "was that I wanted to, not just because it was the right tactical move, because this..." She stopped. Tried again. "I've been doing the math on my own survival for so long that I stopped noticing when the variable changed, when it stopped being just about me." He was very still on the bench, the red light, the sealed space. "I didn't redirect $68 million to save a financial architecture," she said. "I did it because it was yours, and I didn't want them to have it." The silence after that was the kind that has a specific quality, not empty, not waiting, but full of something that's been true for a while and is only now being said out loud. He reached out with his right hand and put it against the side of her face, which was the first time he touched her with anything that wasn't the functional grip of one person pulling another person through a crisis. His hand was warm. It was slightly unsteady in a way that she recognized as the body finally presenting its bill for the past several hours. She put her hand over his and held it there. Neither of them spoke. From above them, through the steel and concrete, she heard the distant, organized sound of the counter-incursion reaching the main entrance, heard it in the building's bones, the percussion of it, muffled and real. It lasted several minutes. Then it stopped. The communication terminal crackled. Kate's voice. "Clear." What? They came out of the bunker into a house that looked like an argument that had been resolved by force. The entrance hall had taken the brunt of it, the marble floor tracked with boot prints and something darker, 2 men down near the western corridor that she didn't look at closely. The windows intact, but the security panel she'd hit still cycling through its residual alarm sequence, winding down now into silence like an instrument losing breath. Cates was at the top of the main staircase. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had been in difficult places and had stopped being surprised by difficult places and had settled into something like competence as a permanent state. He looked at Valentino the way people look at a problem they've managed before and are prepared to manage again. "Hospital," Kate said. "In a minute," Valentino said. "That's not... Where's Marzin?" Cates looked at him. Then, "East reception room, 2 men on him." Valentino moved toward the east reception room. Celine followed. Kate's fell in behind them both, and she understood from his positioning that he'd already made a decision about her. The same recategorization she'd been watching happen across the estate's remaining personnel since the alarms, since the bunker, since the word had moved through the counter-incursion team that she'd redirected the entire operational reserve during an armed takeover and then hit the master override while being physically restrained. People who'd been looking through her were now looking at her. She noticed it and moved through it and kept walking. Marzin was sitting in the east reception room, not in a chair, on the floor, his back against the wall beneath the window that faced the harbor. He had a cut above his left eye that had bled significantly and been ignored. His suit was no longer pleasant. He looked like a man who'd spent 2 years building something and watched it come down in 3 minutes, which was exactly what he was. He looked at Valentino when he came in, then at Celine. His expression was not the hot structural thing she'd seen in the server room. That had burned through and left something colder and more fundamental. The specific expression of a man who'd run the full decision tree and arrived at an end state he'd built contingencies around, but had not, until this moment, genuinely believed he'd reach. How much of the documentation was real? Valentino said. His voice was flat. The flatness had a quality she recognized from 8 weeks of cataloging him. Not the professional flatness, not the transactional one. The one that came from beneath all the others. The one that lived closest to the actual person. Marzin said, the methodology was real. The financial extraction was real. Raphael's theft was real. A pause. The Liangwei connection was constructed. His signature was on the document, but his active involvement was manufactured, Celine said. Marzin looked at her. Yes. So the external threat was inflated to pull the security deployment away from the interior while the coup ran, she said. But the internal corruption was genuine because you needed a real financial crime to legitimize the restructuring. The restructuring required a credible pretext, Marzin said. Raphael provided the pretext. You provided the exposure. He said this without inflection. The accounting of a strategy delivered by the person who'd built it to the person who'd destroyed it. Who knew? Valentino said. Beyond Reeves. Captain Harlan, 2 members of the Seattle Port Authority, 3 individuals in the financial division below Ortega. He looked at the floor between his feet. And Priya Mehta. The name landed in the room with a specific weight. Celine went still. Marzin looked at her. Your stepsister. She was the original contact point for your stepmother's gambling debt. The debt that brought you here was not accidental. He paused. Priya Mehta has been an information asset for this operation for 14 months. Your arrival was not spontaneous. She stood very still in the east reception room and let that restructure everything it needed to restructure. Not spontaneous. She'd been sold to settle a debt. But the debt had been engineered. The path that had put her barefoot in that alley at 2 a.m. had been constructed by people who'd understood that Valentino's organization needed a specific kind of infiltration. The kind that came in as something he'd overlook, something he'd underestimate, something that would be given access because it appeared unthreatening and proved useful. A 24-year-old woman with no standing in his world and a forensic accounting skill set that was exactly what a compromised financial architecture needed. She thought about Diane's too gentle knock on her bedroom door. She thought about Priya standing in the hallway with her eyes aimed at the floor. She thought about the carefully not looking back when they drove away. She stood with all of that and breathed through it. The cold drop in her chest, familiar by now, geologically familiar, the specific sensation of ground that seemed solid revealing the hollow beneath. Valentino was looking at her. She said, "How long have you known?" He didn't answer immediately. She watched his face and she knew the answer before he gave it, because she'd been reading his face for 8 weeks and she knew every register of it. "Since day 16, he said. She looked at him. "Kate's identified the meta connection through a financial trace on the original debt," he said. "I've been—" A pause. The controlled flatness working harder than usual. "Determining what it meant for your involvement." "Determining whether I was part of it," she said. "Yes." She held that. "And what did you determine?" she said. "That you weren't." He held her look. "That you were used the same way the operation used everything else, as a tool, pointed at a target, without your knowledge or consent. She thought about the Thursday presentation, the carefully arranged financial documentation in the library binders, the encrypted phone that had been feeding her communications to Marzin's network, the elegant secondary channel that had been built specifically to be findable by someone with her skill set, to lead her exactly where they needed her to go. She'd been the most sophisticated tool in Marzin's operation. She just hadn't known she was a tool. She thought about her father's kitchen table. Numbers just say what is. She said, "Priya." "She's in Vancouver," Marzin said. "I can give you contact information." "I don't want contact information," she said. He looked at her. "I want the documentation of her involvement," she said. "Every communication, every financial transaction, every operational record that shows the 14 months of her participation in what was done to me." She said it without heat, without the performance of anger, with the flat precision she used for accurate statements. "And I want it in a format that can be delivered to the appropriate authorities in a manner that takes its time, that lands when she stopped expecting it." Marzin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That I can arrange." Valentino made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Very short, very quiet. The sound of something being involuntarily expressed and immediately controlled. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth had done the thing it did. "Later," she said to Marzin. "Someone will contact you about the delivery format." She turned and walked out of the East reception room. The ambulance came 40 minutes later. Cates had called it from the bunker terminal while they were still inside, which was the action of a man who knew his employer better than his employer wanted to be known. Celine sat on the front steps of the estate in the cold morning air while the paramedics worked on Valentino in the entrance hall. The fog was still in off the Pacific, thick and low, collapsing the horizon line into a uniform gray that made the world feel provisional, like a stage set between performances. The harbor was invisible. The cargo ships that usually moved through the distant water were gone behind the white. She was cold. She hadn't been warm since the bunker, and she was past the point of doing anything about it. She sat with her elbows on her knees and her hands loosely clasped, and looked at the fog and thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known 3 hours ago. She thought about Priya's eyes aimed at the floor in the hallway. The particular quality of not looking that she'd read as guilt and cowardice, but was something more operational than that. The performance of a person playing a role in an event they'd helped engineer, trying not to look at what they'd helped bring into motion. She'd spent 11 years living with people who used her. She'd thought the pattern had ended in an alley in the rain. It had just changed forms. She sat with the anger about that, or really sat with it, let it be the size it was rather than managing it into something smaller. It was considerable. It had a specific architecture, built from 11 years of foundations, and it was her anger. It was warranted, and she was going to feel all of it, and then she was going to decide what to do with it. What she was not going to do was let it hollow her out. That was the thing about sustained damage. It wanted to become your defining characteristic, wanted you to organize yourself around it, wanted the wound to be the whole story. She was going to let it be part of the story. The fog moved. Somewhere out on the water, invisible, a foghorn sounded, low and continuous and utterly indifferent to what had happened in this building tonight. She thought about her father's quarterly tax document spread on the kitchen table. She thought about a 9-year-old girl being told that her skill was not a real skill and would not take her anywhere. She thought about what the past 8 weeks had taken that girl and done with her. Footsteps on the steps behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the weight of them, the specific rhythm. Valentino sat down beside her on the steps. His shoulder had been properly dressed. She could see the professional bandaging at the collar of a clean shirt someone had found for him. He looked like a man who'd been told to rest and had agreed to this as a compromise position. They sat in silence for a moment. The fog and the cold and the distant foghorn. "Marzin," she said. "Being dealt with. Harlan and the others." "Also," she nodded. "Priya Mehta," he said. "I'll have someone move on the documentation today." "I know." She looked at the fog. "I'm not in a hurry. I want it done right." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The 68 million. I'll transfer it back to the primary accounts today," she said. "I'll need terminal access in approximately 40 minutes." "I know you'll transfer it back," he said. "That wasn't what I was going to say." She looked at him. The organization's financial architecture needs rebuilding from the foundation, he said. Not just cleanup, structural rebuilding, the compromised systems, the penetrated networks, the personnel in the financial division who were part of what Marzin built. He looked at the fog. That's a significant project. It requires someone with specific skills and the willingness to operate inside an environment that most people would reasonably choose to leave. She said nothing. I'm not asking you to stay because you owe me something, he said. I'm asking you to stay because the work is real and the terms we agreed on are real, and because... He stopped, started again. Because I've spent 8 weeks watching someone do the most precise and fearless work I've ever seen in this organization. And that person built a contingency account on day 19 and hit a master override while being physically restrained, and I would like her to continue operating in my vicinity. She looked at the side of his face, the scar along his jaw, the tiredness that was permanent now and had stopped trying to hide itself. Your vicinity, she said. As a starting position, he said. The terms can be renegotiated. She thought about the entrance hall conversation she'd started in the bunker with when this is done. We're going to have a conversation. She thought about his hand against the side of her face in the red light, the warmth of it, the slight unsteadiness. She thought about the old Celine, the one who'd spent 11 years staying small, staying careful, trying to be good enough at things that nobody valued, getting up every morning in a house that wasn't hers and going to a job that didn't see her and coming home to a family that was using her and not knowing until a midnight alley in the rain. How completely and systematically she'd been arranged into a corner. She thought about what it had cost to walk out of that corner, what it kept costing. She thought about the cost being worth it. The directorship, she said, formal contract, real authority. Yes. Compensation structure we negotiate today, not later. Agreed. And the arrangement, she stopped, chose the next words carefully, because she was done with careful in the old sense, but she was building something new with the word, something that meant precise rather than small. The arrangement between us is separate from the professional one, separate terms, neither contingent on the other. He turned and looked at her, the fog between them and the harbor, the cold air, the estate at their backs, with everything it had survived in the last 8 hours. Agreed, he said. She nodded. She looked at the fog. The conversation from the bunker, she said. The one I said we were going to have. I remember. I'm going to need some time before I can have it properly, she said. What Marzin told me about how I got here, I need to sit with that for a while. Understand what it means. I know. It doesn't change what I said in the server room. I know that too. She turned and looked at him fully, the way she hadn't let herself look at him for 8 weeks, without the professional frame, without the transactional architecture. Just him. The person underneath the empire, underneath the name, underneath 37 years of operating in a world that punished softness so comprehensively that softness had learned to live in different forms. In the almost smiles, in the flat voice that said her name with particular weight, in a hand against her face in red light in a sealed room. She said, You could have told me about the meta connection when Kate's found it. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fog. Because by the time I knew, he said, I had already... He stopped. The information about Priya would have told you that your arrival here was engineered, which would have raised questions about whether I was part of the engineering. Were you? No. I know, she said. I worked that out. I know you did. A pause. I didn't tell you, because I didn't want you to leave before I could show you that. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the thing she'd named on the floor of the server room, still there, fully present, not managing itself into anything smaller. She turned back to the fog. She sat with everything. The weight of what the last 8 hours had cost, the shape of what she'd found in this place she'd been delivered to against her will, the strange and particular truth that the worst night of her life had deposited her somewhere she hadn't expected to be able to breathe. And she'd breathed and kept breathing and built something in the breathing. The fog was beginning to lift at the edges. She could see the water now, a strip of it, dark and moving, the harbor emerging from the white. Somewhere in it, a cargo ship materialized slowly, its hull solid and gray, moving with the indifferent purpose of something that had its own destination and kept to it regardless of weather. She watched it. 3 months later, the organization had changed its shape. Not overnight, not cleanly. The work was slow and sometimes brutal, and involved conversations she'd never trained for, with port authority contacts and financial intermediaries and men who'd worked under compromised structures for years and needed to understand concretely why the new architecture was different and why it would hold. She had those conversations. She sat across tables from men who'd spent their careers reading people for weakness, and she gave them nothing to read except competence. And eventually most of them stopped looking for the weakness and started looking at the work. Harlan was removed. The financial division personnel who'd been part of Marzin's network were identified. Her documentation was complete and precise and survived every challenge, and dealt with in the manner of this world, which she understood now and operated inside without the layer of willful ignorance she'd maintained for the first weeks. She understood what she was part of. She'd made the decision with her eyes open, in the bunker, in the red light, before the conversation that had confirmed it. She didn't make herself feel better about the moral complexity with rationalizations. She held it plainly, as a fact about her situation, and she navigated it the way she navigated everything, with precision and without flinching from what was true. The documentation on Priya Mehta was delivered to a federal financial crimes unit in a format designed to unfold slowly, with no visible originating party. It landed on a Tuesday in early November. Celine read the confirmation in a one-line message from a number she didn't save, and then deleted the message and went back to the financial model she'd been building. She didn't feel the triumph she'd once imagined she would feel. She felt something quieter, the specific sensation of a debt that doesn't need to be forgiven because it's been accurately recorded, documented, filed, sent to its appropriate destination. Not rage, not relief, just completion, the closing of an account. Diane and Priya arrived at the estate on a Wednesday afternoon in December. She hadn't arranged for it. She hadn't known it was coming. Kate's came to find her in the Eastern Wing office. She had an office now, hers, with a window that faced the water, and told her there were 2 women at the gate claiming the Vescari name as authorization for a loan they said had been arranged. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went downstairs. They were in the entrance hall. The same marble floor, the same windows, different light. December afternoon light, low and golden, coming through the western glass and lying across the floor in long rectangles. Diane was wearing a coat that had seen better years. Priya was standing behind her with the same quality of not looking that Celine had read for years as personality, and now understood as the expression of a person who'd been doing things they couldn't look directly at for a long time. Diane saw her, and the expression that crossed her face was complicated in a way Celine didn't try to read. Something with hope in it, and calculation, and underneath both of those something that might have been something older and more genuine. A woman who'd made choices, many of them terrible, looking at the consequence of those choices walking toward her. "Celine," Diane said. She stopped in front of them. She looked at Diane. She looked at Priya, who finally looked back at her with eyes that had the quality of someone who'd been waiting for a specific moment for months and had arrived at it and found it was nothing like they'd imagined. She didn't feel what she'd spent years anticipating she would feel in this moment. No burning triumph, no desire to dismantle them the way they dismantled her. None of the operatic justice her imagination had staged during bad nights in borrowed rooms. She felt something simpler, a woman standing in her own space, in a life she'd built from the material of her own survival, looking at the people who'd sold her and finding that they were smaller than the damage they'd done. She said, "There's no loan." Diane opened her mouth. "There's no arrangement," Celine said. "Whatever you were told, whatever you believed you had access to through this name, it doesn't exist. Not for you." "Celine, I'm not going to hurt you," she said. "I'm not going to have anyone hurt you. I'm going to have you driven to wherever you need to go, and after that, the name Vescari is not available to you, for any purpose, under any framing." Priya said her name. The first time in this conversation, her voice had something cracked in it, not performance, something genuine and late arriving, the specific quality of remorse that comes when the thing you've done has finished unfolding and you can finally see its full shape. Celine looked at her. She thought about what she'd told Marzin in the East reception room. I want it to land when she stopped expecting it. It had landed. She could see it had landed, in the week's deep quality of the exhaustion in Priya's face, the particular shadows under her eyes. She said, I know what you did. I know all of it. She said it without heat, without the performance of revelation. Just the flat, accurate statement. I'm not interested in your explanation, and I don't need your apology. What I needed, I got. Priya looked at her. You're going to go now, Celine said. And that's the last time I'm going to speak to either of you. She turned and walked back toward the staircase. Behind her, she heard Diane say something. She didn't catch the words. Didn't try to. She heard Kate's moving to manage the exit. She heard the sound of the entrance hall returning to its normal register. She went upstairs. She went to the office with the window that faced the water. She sat down at her desk and put her hands flat on the surface and looked out at the Pacific and the December afternoon light. The water was the color of pewter, and it moved the way it always moved. The same continuous, indifferent movement, the same complete lack of interest in what happened on the land above it. She sat there for a while. She didn't cry. Not because she'd decided not to, but because the thing she felt didn't have tears in it. It had something quieter, the sensation of a long-held weight being set down. Not dropped, not thrown, just set down with care. Placed on the floor. Left there. When the light shifted toward evening, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the office. The specific weight and rhythm of them. A knock. He always knocked now. It had begun sometime in October, and she'd never mentioned it, and he'd never explained it. It was just there, the small voluntary acknowledgement that the space was hers. Come in, she said. Valentino opened the door and stood in the frame with his hands in his pockets and looked at her. The shoulder had healed him, mostly, not perfectly. The movement on his left side still carried a slight guarding quality she'd stopped pointing out because pointing it out produced exactly the same expression every time. How did it go? He said. Done, she said. He nodded. He came into the office and stood beside the desk and looked out the window at the water with her. The December evening coming in off the Pacific, the first stars appearing above the fog line, the harbor lights beginning to show in the dark. She said, I want to take a week. He looked at her. Not away from here, she said. Just a week where I'm not in the financial architecture, where I'm something else. What else? She thought about it. I don't know yet. That's the point. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the week after Christmas. Yes. I'll tell Kate's. Tell Mrs. Harrow, too, she said. I want different food, not the institutional rotation. The corner of his mouth moved. The same almost thing it had been doing for 3 months now, except that it had been resolving more fully lately. Still not a complete smile, but enough of one to mean something. I'll tell her you said institutional, he said. She'll be thrilled. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. The evening light, the water below them, carrying its cargo ships toward their destinations, indifferent and continuous. The office that was hers, the work that was hers, the life assembled from the materials of a midnight alley and bare feet on wet asphalt and a choice she hadn't been given and had made anyway, over and over, in every room and corridor of this place, until the making of it became the shape of who she was. She reached across the desk and put her hand over his, the way she'd done in the bunker in the red light. His hand turned over and his fingers closed around hers. They stood at the window together and watched the evening come in off the Pacific. The harbor lights shimmered across dark water. The fog settled. The city went on doing what cities do, burning its lights against the dark, spinning itself forward into another night, indifferent to the small human transactions of survival and damage, and the thing that sometimes grows in the space between them, the thing that doesn't have an innocent name but is real and hard-won and worth what it cost. Below the bluff, the waves kept coming. They always did. Fade out,